Amy and I had always enjoyed hiking together, but this trip was different. It wasn't planned. We hadn't told anyone where we were going, and by the time we realized how deep into the forest we were, it was already too late to turn back. The evening had started innocently enough. We were both restless after a long week of work, and I remembered hearing about this forest not too far from the city. They said it had beautiful trails, though not many people ventured to the far end. So, I convinced Amy to join me for an evening hike, promising we'd be back before nightfall. We followed the trail easily at first, the canopy above us glowing golden with the last light of the sun. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet where even the sound of our footsteps seemed loud. There was a map at the entrance of the forest, one of those old, weather-beaten boards with faded lines showing the trail routes. We took a picture of it with our phones, just to be safe, and headed deeper in. As we walked, the trail grew less defined, more overgrown. The trees around us began to look ancient, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. We joked about getting lost, but there was a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The forest felt heavier, darker, as if the deeper we went, the less it wanted us there. After a while, the map on my phone was useless. The trail ended, abruptly, right where the map had shown. But there was no sign, no clearing, no path leading back. Just trees, dense and oppressive, as far as we could see. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was quickly swallowed in shadows. But in the distance, faintly through the trees, we could see the glow of the city lights. It was comforting, that tiny glimmer of civilization, so we decided to head toward it, veering off the trail into the darker parts of the forest. We thought it would be quicker that way. We were wrong. It wasn't long before we heard it scream. A blood-curdling, high-pitched scream that cut through the night air like a knife. Amy froze, her face draining of color. My heart pounded in my chest as I instinctively grabbed her arm, pulling her closer. It wasn't an animal. It was human. Someone, somewhere in those woods, was in trouble. Or worse. We didn't say a word, but we both started moving, faster this time, not toward the scream but toward the city lights. The forest felt like it was closing in around us. The trees, once beautiful and serene, now loomed over us, their branches like skeletal fingers. Another scream, this one closer. Panic gripped me, and I could tell Amy felt it too. We looked around, eyes wide, trying to figure out what to do. And that's when we both had the same thought: climb. Amy was a better climber than me, but we both managed to scramble up a tall oak tree, high enough that the branches concealed us but low enough that we could still see the ground below. We held our breath, clinging to the rough bark, waiting. The forest was still for a moment, silent. Then, through the darkness, we saw a figure moving slowly through the trees, dragging something behind it. My heart stopped. It looked like a man, but something about him was off. His gait wasn't even, like his legs didn't bend properly, and his arms hung at his sides, one of them holding an old, rusted axe. He was tall, and naturally tall, and his face was hidden beneath a mess of wild hair and shadow. He stopped directly beneath our tree. Amy squeezed my arm, her grip so tight it hurt, but I didn't move. I didn't breathe. We watched as the figure tilted his head back slightly, sniffing the air like an animal. He let out a low, guttural growl and then began shouting, his voice deep and distorted, as if he was talking to someone. But there was no one else there. He shouted again, louder this time, his voice echoing through the trees. We couldn't make out what he was saying, but it didn't matter. The words didn't sound human. It was more like a chant, a broken, frenzied string of syllables that sent a shiver down my spine. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he stopped. Silence. Amy and I exchanged terrified glances, neither of us daring to speak. We stayed frozen in that tree for what felt like hours, watching as the figure circled the area below us, mumbling to himself, occasionally swinging the axe into the air as if chopping at something invisible. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, he left. His strange, shuffling footsteps faded into the distance, and the forest seemed to breathe again. Amy and I waited, our limbs stiff and cramped from holding the same position for so long. When we were sure the figure was gone, we climbed down from the tree, our legs shaky, our nerves frayed. Without a word, we started running toward the edge of the forest, toward the safety of the city lights we had seen the night before. As we broke through the trees into a clearing near the edge of the woods, we both stopped dead in our tracks. There, in the center of the clearing, was a tree stump. And embedded in that stump was the axe, the same one the figure had been carrying the night before. Amy looked at me, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't need to say anything. We both knew we had to get out of there. We bolted across the clearing, our footsteps loud in the quiet morning air, not stopping until we reached the open field that led back to the city. We didn't talk about what had happened, not then, not for a long time. We just wanted to forget it, to pretend it had never happened. But there was one thing that neither of us could forget, one final, horrifying detail that haunts me to this day. When we passed that tree stump in the clearing, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The exit was embedded in the stump, yes, but it wasn't just resting there. It was freshly embedded. As if someone had only just stuck it there moments before we arrived. And when I looked closer, I saw that the wood around the axe was wet. Not with dew, but with something darker, something thicker. We ran faster after that, not stopping until we were far away from that cursed forest. I haven't been back since, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I think about that figure in the woods. I think about the way he moved, the way he shouted into the empty forest. And I wonder, just for a moment, if he was really alone out there, or if something else was listening. I had always enjoyed hiking, especially in the more remote areas where the forest seemed endless, untouched, and uninviting to most. There was something about the solitude, the way the trees seemed to close in around you, the smell of damp earth, and the quiet hum of nature that drew me in. This time, I had planned a solo trip, just me and the wilderness, for a few days of quiet reflection and some much-needed escape from the stress of everyday life. The trail I had chosen was off the beaten path, barely marked on any maps, and had a reputation for being one of the least visited. I liked the sound of that. No people, just me and the forest. It was early autumn, and the leaves were beginning to turn shades of red, orange, and gold, giving the woods a warm, inviting glow during the day. But as the sun began to set, the shadows grew longer, and the forest seemed to take on a different character, something more secretive and unsettling. I set up camp in a small clearing just before dark, a perfect spot near a babbling stream. I pitched my tent, made a fire, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The sounds of the forest at night were usually soothing to me, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant chirping of crickets, but tonight felt different. The woods seemed quieter than usual, almost as if they were holding their breath, waiting for something. It was just a feeling at first, that creeping sensation at the back of your neck when you think you're being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone out here, miles from anyone. What could possibly be watching me? I stirred the fire, the flames crackling as I added another log. The light danced in front of me, casting flickering shadows across the trees. The darkness beyond the fire felt thick, like it was pressing in, watching from the edges where the light couldn't reach. I heard a snap, a branch breaking somewhere off to my left. My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly dismissed it. Probably just an animal, a deer or a raccoon. Nothing to be worried about. But then I heard it again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from my pack, and shone it into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and tangled bushes. No movement, no eyes reflecting back at me, nothing. I turned back to the fire, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind, maybe an animal scurrying through the woods. But the feeling of being watched was growing stronger, and the silence was unnerving. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. As the night wore on, I tried to settle into my tent, but sleep wouldn't come. Every rustle, every distant sound made me sit up and listen, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that there was nothing out there, but the fear gnawed at me, relentless. It must have been around midnight when I heard it again, a distinct, heavy footstep outside my tent. My blood turned cold. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another footstep, closer this time, followed by a slow, deliberate dragging sound. Whatever it was moving toward my tent. I scrambled for the flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. I shone the light toward the sound, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the thick canvas of the tent. My heart raced as the footsteps stopped just outside, followed by a deep, guttural breathing. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, without warning, the side of the tent rippled as if something had brushed against it, something large. I jumped back, my mind racing with fear. I wanted to run, but where would I go? I was miles from civilization, alone in the dark woods. The breathing outside grew louder, more labored, as if whatever was out there was struggling to contain itself. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, something slammed into the side of the tent, hard enough to knock me over. I scrambled to my feet, fumbling for the zipper, but before I could get it open, the thing outside let out a low, guttural growl, a sound so deep and unnatural it made my skin crawl. In a panic, I tore open the tent and bolted into the night, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I ran blindly through the trees. I didn't stop to look back, didn't even think. I just ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest closed in around me, the branches tearing at my clothes, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I stumbled over a root and fell hard, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and skidding across the ground. For a moment, I lay there, dazed, trying to catch my breath. The woods were deathly silent now, the air thick with tension. I reached for the flashlight, but as my fingers closed around it, I heard a sound that froze me in place. Laughter. It was faint at first, almost a whisper carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. Low, chilling, and wrong, the kind of laughter that didn't belong in a place like this, that no human should ever hear. I looked around, trying to find the source, but the trees pressed in from all sides, their shadows long and menacing. Then, from the darkness, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam, tall, gaunt, its face hidden in shadow. The laughter stopped, replaced by a heavy, rhythmic breathing. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure took a step closer, the sound of its footfalls heavy and deliberate. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand as I tore through the woods. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. The woods seemed endless, the trees stretching on forever, but eventually, I broke through the underbrush and stumbled onto the trail. My legs were shaking, my lungs burning, but I didn't stop. I ran until I saw the faint glow of my campfire in the distance. When I finally reached the camp, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. I glanced around, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me, but there was nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my back against the tent, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever it was to return. But it never did. At first light, I packed up my gear and left, not bothering to eat or even extinguish the dying fire. I just wanted to get out of those woods, to leave behind whatever it was that had stalked me in the night. As I drove away, the trees closed in on either side of the road, their branches casting long shadows across the pavement. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. But the road remained empty, the woods silent. I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened in those woods was behind me. But as I reached the highway and glanced in the mirror one last time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the back seat, barely visible in the dim light of dawn, was a small, dirty handprint. A handprint that hadn't been there before. I haven't gone back to the woods since, and I never will. Whatever it was that found me that night, I know it's still out there, waiting.